Things were quite peaceful for a few months. Then one night I was woken up to the blasting sound of the carbon monoxide detector alarm beeping just outside the bedroom. My husband and I sprang from the bed with our hearts pounding to shut it off and check on our son. We did a walk around the house to make sure everything was okay. I noted the time, 3 in the morning, and crawled back into bed once I changed my shorts. The next night it happened again at 3 in the morning, right on the dot. I pushed the reset button on the detector, stood there staring blankly at it for a few minutes, then went back to bed. By the third night of it going off, again precisely at 3 in the morning, I pulled the batteries out because I'd had enough. I called the propane company the next morning and asked them to send someone over to check the furnace for leaks. A gentleman came a few days later to check the furnace. He did a walkthrough and performed an air quality test, but came up with nothing. I put the batteries back in the detector, and to my surprise, it remained quiet. I always had mixed feelings about that house. One day you'd feel safe, warm, and happy, and the next you'd feel terrified and on edge. It always went back and forth like that. I would always smell different odors lingering in the house. The most prominent ones were perfume and cookies. I would smell those mainly in the hallway and living room. Those made me feel protected, like my grandma was lingering, watching over me. On other days, I'd get a strong whiff of raw sewage. That smell made me terrified because something that smelled of a decaying body couldn't be a good thing. Some nights the smell would be so strong it would wake me up from a deep sleep, and I would have to cover my nose in disgust. Then, of course, I wouldn't be able to fall back into my slumber knowing a bad, or perhaps just a smelly entity, was hanging out in my bedroom. Either way, I tried to ignore it as much as I could. My husband decided to go on a hunting trip one weekend. He packed his bags and set off Friday morning. That night, everything was peachy, and I enjoyed having the bed all to myself. I did some reading, ate snacks, stayed up late watching a movie, and slept like a log. Saturday, I felt uneasy, and I was having trouble sleeping that night. I asked my son to sleep in my room so I wouldn't feel so alone in the dark. He crawled in beside me, and I felt better knowing someone was there. In the morning, we both woke up to the birds chirping and the sun shining. I said good morning to him, and when he rolled over to look at me, I noticed a massive scratch down the side of his face. I sat up startled and asked him if he was hurt. He said no, with a puzzling look. The scratch was the width of a fingernail and started on the right side of his cheek and stopped short of his chin. The scratch was so deep it wasn't even bleeding, just clear liquid was oozing out. I looked at his wound and couldn't figure out how it happened. I inspected the pillows and sheets for anything that could cause it, but came up with nothing. I still don't know how he slept through it, as the scratch was so rooted. I was surprised he didn't wake up when it happened. It took months to heal, and even now the scar remains. Summer had rolled around, and my husband and son took a weekend trip. I opted to stay behind as I was going to miss the opportunity to have some alone time. At the time, I thought it was a fantastic idea until nightfall crept in. Our house was somewhat on the outskirts of town, with only a handful of others surrounding it. Our place would get uncomfortably hot at night, but my bed was in the perfect place to have the window open so a gentle breeze could blow in. I could hear the frogs croaking not far from the yard, our bedroom fan making a buzzing noise, as it always did, and the old clock at the end of the hall ticking relentlessly. I had been laying in bed for a few short minutes, staring at the ceiling fan, when suddenly every sound stopped. Literally, every sound ceased at the same time. I sat up thinking I had gone deaf. It was like someone had put a bubble around my head to block out the sounds. I was pretty scared. The only way I could tell if I hadn't gone deaf was to talk out loud, so I started humming nervously. Yep, I could hear myself, but the buzzing of the fan, ticking of the clock, and the croaking all stopped. I put my head close to the window and heard nothing. I stood up to listen to this spinning fan. Nothing. I walked down the hall and tapped on the clock to see if the second hand was still moving around. It was, but there was no ticking sound. I could hear my feet walking beneath me, but everything else failed to be heard. I went back to the room and tried to pull the wax out of my ears, but it didn't help. I finally fell asleep in the strange quietness, and when I woke up in the morning, all the sounds had been restored. I couldn't explain why everything had gone silent. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe time had stopped. Whatever the reason, it was unnerving. That same summer, my husband decided to build a deck off the back of the house, and plans were quickly in the works. We started leveling the ground to make room for the cedar beams and began laying the foundation. Our big dog would sit outside in the shade with her tongue hanging out and lazily watch us work. One day she started digging a hole in one spot by the corner of the house. I scolded her and I tried to cover the hole with the loose dirt as best I could. Now this big old dog was not one to dig. It was too much exercise for her old bones. Every day she would keep digging in this one spot. I decided to humor her and let her dig until she played herself out. She would dig, stop and look, then stick her nose deep into the earth and sniff. I went over to her, squatted down, and said, "Hey, girl, what's under there? Treasure? Did you find some gold?" I chuckled, and when I stood up, I could hear the ground beneath my foot was somewhat hollow and slightly bowed inward. I walked back and forth, gently stomping on it to pinpoint how big the hollow was. I outlined the borders with my finger and stepped back. It looked like a small grave. It was about 2 feet wide by 4 feet long. I had the urge to find a shovel and start digging, but with it being so close to the house, I didn't want to hit any on water or power lines. The dog quit digging after that, and I kept scratching my head. Now the dog found something, but I'm pretty positive it wasn't gold, which was too bad. I told my husband about the strange hollow spot in the ground, but he shrugged it off and kept on building the deck. I always thought of going back to dig or making a trip to the town hall to find property blueprints and see what used to be on the land before it was developed. I never got around to it, and digging is out of the question since the deck is now built on top of it. One evening, I was inside the house finishing up laundry, and my husband was out in the shed puttering around looking for his tool belt. The street light on the corner had been out for some time, and the dimly lit solar lights running down the house did little to provide any light. I had a basket of fresh laundry in my hand when my husband came in the front door with this glazed look on his eyes, sporting pale skin. I set down the laundry and asked him what was wrong. He gave me a half-hearted chuckle and stopped. He shook his head as if he was reasoning with himself and stood there silently. I said, "Are you going to tell me what's wrong?" He shook his head again. I couldn't tell what he was pondering, but it was something deep. I let out a frustrated huff and started to fold laundry. A few minutes later, he started muttering something. I said, "Okay, are you going to tell me what's wrong?" He finally started speaking. He said, "I was rummaging around in the shed. I was starting to get frustrated because it was so dark I couldn't find my tool belt. I kept bumping into boxes until I softly spoke out to myself that would be nice if I would have some light. All of a sudden, there was light. I looked over to see the flashlight had turned on by itself in the corner, and it was sticking out of my tool belt. Now at this point I had to laugh because it was comical. I asked what he did. He replied, "Well," I quickly reached over, grabbed it, said thanks, and bolted back inside the house. He shrugged, and I gave a half smile and went on folding laundry. He never spoke of it again. Even a few months later when I mentioned it, he looked at me like I was crazy and it never happened. Maybe it was too much for him to fathom, and he blocked it from his mind. Some time had gone by, and the shed episode was forgotten. By my husband, not me. My husband had stayed up late one evening to play on the computer. I had already been sleeping for a few hours when I was woken up by a shaking bed. It wasn't a violent shake, but more of a vibrating feeling. I sat up and flipped open the covers, checking my legs for muscle spasms, but couldn't figure out why the bed was vibrating. I didn't want to stick around, so I walked tiredly down the hall to where my husband was playing games, and I stood at the door. I was standing there quietly for a few minutes when he finally turned around. He was completely startled and asked me what I was doing. I told him the bed was shaking. Then I turned around to stretch out on the couch. I didn't want to go back to the room until he came with me. He shut down the computer after a few minutes and motioned for me to follow him. I walked sleepily behind him down the hall, and when we reached the bedroom door, he didn't go in, but slowly slipped his hand around the corner to flick on the light. He pulled his hand back quickly like a monster was waiting to grab his arm, and suspiciously scanned the room with squinted eyes. I walked right in, jumped in bed, and pulled the covers over me. He turned off the light and jumped in beside me, but I could tell he was trying to figure things out. I had a great sleep, but I'm not sure if he did. He never believed in ghosts or the paranormal, but he was somewhat bothered by the strange occurrence. Maybe he was just pretending he wasn't scared, so he didn't look like a coward. We traveled to the city one weekend and ended up coming back home with the cutest little Shih Tzu. Our dogs immediately got along, which was excellent. Now the Shih Tzu would always sleep in the room with us, under the covers, all nice and cozy. She rarely went into my son's room. It was one room she didn't like to hang out in and would not go any further than the door entrance. One sunny day, my sister came over in the afternoon to visit, and we were sitting at the dining room table. We were laughing and chatting. I got up to sweep the floor in the hallway. I noticed my little Shih Tzu slowly sniffing the air heading into my son's room. She was in there for but a moment when I was startled by a loud drawn-out yelp, and she came racing out of the room. She reminded me of Scooby-Doo and Shaggy when they're trying to skedaddle and their feet are moving but their bodies are not. She went zipping between my legs and ran to the living room. I assumed my son had accidentally stepped on her, so I annoyingly yelled from a distance what had happened. I quickly looked over to my sister and saw she was clenching onto my son, who was beside her the whole time. Her eyes were so big I thought they were going to pop out of her head. I stopped to think for a moment and realized no one was in my son's room. I held the broom like a shotgun, pointed straight in front of me, peeked around his door, but saw nothing. I called back to my sister, who kept asking what was there, and I assured her it was nothing at all. I went back to sweep, but my partially freaked out sister went home. This scenario happened on a few occasions with my dog, almost as if she was being coaxed into the room by a sweet aroma, only to get the crap scared of her by who knows what. Keep watching for part 3.